of St. Louis and the Ozark Mountain region, anti-slavery sentiment prevailed. When the Civil War began in 1861, Missouri's allegiance was of vital concern to the federal government. The state's strategic position on the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, as well as its abundant manpower and natural resources, made it an important federal asset. A state convention was held in February 1861 to consider Missouri's succession. Missourians voted to remain loyal to the Union, yet Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson sought The Ray House is believed to have been built in the early 1850s by John Ray, who moved into the area around 1845, a widower with a young daughter. In 1849, Ray married his neighbor, Roxana Steele, a widow with 4 children and 2 slaves. Soon the Rays had children of their own, and John Ray built this house to accommodate his growing family. Ray built this house along the Wire Road, and from 1858 to 1861, a mail coach stopped here twice a week to pick up and drop off the mail. Ray served as the local postmaster from 1856 to 1866, and his house was the local post office.
I didn't know that.
By the day of the battle, John Ray owned over 400 acres of land, 7 milk cows, 5 horses, 4 oxen, 6 beef cattle, and 50 hogs. His farm produced 272 bushels of wheat, 1,000 bushels of Indian corn, 5 tons of hay, 300 bushels of oats, 50 bushels of Irish potatoes, 25 bushels of sweet potatoes, 500 pounds of butter, 60 pounds of wool, and fruit from an orchard across the Wire Road. Nearly all of this was confiscated by the Southern armies to feed their men, a fate suffered by other families living in the valley. The Ray family and their home provide an excellent example of the impact of the Civil War on the lives of civilians. Much of their property was confiscated or destroyed, as was the case all over the nation, as both armies left paths of destruction behind them. Homes near battle sites were often used as field hospitals during and after battles throughout the Civil War. And the Ray home provides a pristine, tangible example of the conditions faced by families whose homes were used to care for wounded and dying soldiers. The Ray home was occupied during the battle as a Confederate field hospital and housed wounded soldiers for many weeks following the battle. As slaveholders, the Ray family would have felt the impact of the emancipation of Missouri slaves passed by the legislature in St. Louis in 1865. The 6-hour battle, fought around their home and in their fields, forever changed the lives of the Rays, their slaves, and the other families who lived on or near the battlefield. The Civil War had a profound impact, not only on the soldiers who fought in the armies, but on their families and the lives of those whose property was used as the staging ground for the conflict. The Ray House and Spring House are the only surviving structures from the battle being built in the early 1850s. The Ray family is typical of slaveholding families prior to and throughout the Civil War. Like many other slaveholding farmers in southwestern Missouri, Ray was loyal to the Union, which allowed him to maintain his federal job as a U.S. postmaster for the Wilsons Creek community. The Ray House was fired upon by Union artillery until a yellow hospital flag was raised over the house by Confederate forces. John Ray was able to watch the battle in his cornfield and on Bloody Hill from his porch on the front of the house. Yet in spite of this, the house was spared destruction or damage. Joseph Sharp's house was not so lucky, suffering extensive damage. Certainly the Ray house, being used as a hospital, spared it from significant damage, yet having their house transformed into a hospital likely changed the lives of the Ray family.
Enter your stop number now.
Slavery in border states such as Missouri did not fit the cultural stereotype most people have. Larger plantations with over 20 slaves were not normal in Missouri. Instead, smaller farms with a few slaves were more typical in southwestern Missouri. John Ray owned 5 slaves on the day of the battle. 24-year-old Aunt Rhoda and her 4 daughters, ages 8, 6, 4, and 2. Joseph Sharp, whose farm was just down the wire road from the Rays, owned 3 slaves. On farms such as these, the farmer and his children would have worked in the fields with the slaves. And in the case of the Rays, there were no male slaves to do heavy work in the fields. Slavery was still slavery, and slaves desired their freedom. Prior to the war, John Ray had owned Rhoda's companion, Wiley, who frequently attempted to run away. But in 1856, he sold Wiley to John Fulbright for $827. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1862 did not free Missouri slaves, just as it did not free slaves in other border states such as Kentucky or Maryland. Missouri slaves were freed on January 11, 1865 by act of the Missouri State Legislature in St. Louis. Ratification of the 13th Amendment abolished slavery at the end of the war.
This says press 7.
The location of Civil War battles was rarely happenstance, with armies blindly stumbling into each other in open terrain. Rather, transportation routes such as rivers and roads were both military objectives and the means by which men and supplies were moved, especially in the western theaters of the war where railroads were limited. The Battle of Wilson's Creek occurred along a major highway of its day, the Wire Road. From 1836 to 1838, the road that later became known as the Wire Road became a military road to link Fort Smith, Arkansas with Jefferson Barracks just south of St. Louis on the Mississippi River. In time, the road became known as the State Road or the Fayetteville Road. In 1859, the Missouri and Western Telegraph Company was contracted by the state of Missouri to build a telegraph line. Beginning that fall, workmen were engaged in constructing telephone poles and stringing wire along existing highways. The state road running through Springfield and going south to Fort Smith was one of these roads, and locals began referring to the road as the Telegraph Wire Road or simply the Wire Road. Mile markers were placed on the poles indicating distances to towns along the road, and during the Civil War, the telegraph line was often cut by opposing forces to disrupt enemy communications. During the Civil War, 3 battles in the Trans-Mississippi Theater were fought along the Wire Road: Wilson's Creek, Pea Ridge, and Prairie Grove. Because the Wire Road provided transportation through the Ozarks connecting Arkansas with Missouri, it became the focal point of battles and guerrilla skirmishes throughout the war. Following the Civil War, railroads were constructed in southwest Missouri and northern Arkansas, and the Wire Road was no longer a major transportation route. By the end of the century, much of the road had fallen into disrepair and was no longer being utilized. Local county roads ran along portions of the Wire Road, but modern highways soon replaced it.
Enter your stop number.
Encampments. In August of 1861, Missouri State Guard Major General Sterling Price and Confederate Brigadier General Benjamin McCullough established their headquarters in and around the home of farmer William B. Edwards, a pro-Union sympathizer. Edwards migrated from Tennessee in 1841 and settled in Missouri with his wife Mary, a native of Illinois. Edwards, Mary, and their 19-year-old son had fled their home before the battle began, so they were not present during the conflict. The majority of the Confederate and Missouri State Guard troops were camped in the field alongside Wilson's Creek and the Wire Road on this section of the battlefield. The present cabin at this site is not the original Edwards home, but it is believed to be a cabin built by the same person who constructed the original. The Edwards family consisted of William Edwards, his wife Mary, and their 19-year-old son. All of them lived together in a one-room cabin, roughly built but efficient. The Edwards are a good representative of the typical frontier family. They were subsistence farmers, less wealthy than their neighbors the Rays, who lived on the fruits of their labor. This cabin is a good example of a cabin in which the average frontiersman and his family would have lived and worked. Warden Fox Jackson. Price was eating breakfast near Edward's cabin when the battle began. He quickly moved to stop his mostly inexperienced troops from fleeing before Lyon's advancing army in the initial attack early on August 10, 1861. At this crucial moment, when all might have been lost, Price seized control. General Price was quickly able to end the dreadful conclusion among the troops streaming off Bloody Hill and rally these troops to him, moving them back into the battle against Lyon's stalled army. Even though several bullets pierced his clothing and he was painfully wounded in the side, General Price remained extremely calm. Just before the final phase of the battle, Price told an Arkansas unit to keep as cool as the inside of a cucumber and give them thunder. This final southern assault exhausted the Union troops left standing on Bloody Hill. This left the new federal leader, Major Samuel Sturgis, little choice but to retreat to Springfield. When Price was equally exhausted but still willing and able to fight Missouri State Guardsmen once again crested Bloody Hill, they found the Federals gone and themselves the victors. The Company K, 3rd Louisiana, recalled the devastation of the farm of Joseph and Mary Sharp, located near where you stand. Immediately in the rear of the battery was a pretty substantial farmhouse with extensive barns and outhouses. All the buildings were completely riddled by cannon shot. I was sent with a small party to search all of the houses in case some of the enemy had taken refuge or hidden themselves there. We found several of the enemy in a hayloft who surrendered as prisoners. I forced the back door of the dwelling house, which was locked, and entered the kitchen. Several cannon shots had passed through, and the floor was strewn with dust and broken crockery. I examined the other rooms, but found nobody. I was about to retire when one of the boys called to me that there was a stair down to a cellar, and we might catch someone down there. A woman jumped up and confronted me. The old woman went up to the stairs first, but on seeing the wreck and looking out and seeing the dead men and the horses lying about the front of the house, she broke out in a greater fury than ever. Who was going to pay for all of this? Who was going to take away them dead folks and dead horses? Was she to have them lying stinking around her house? I was glad to get away and join the regiment, which was now forming to proceed to another part of the field. Joseph and Mary Sharp were among the more prosperous slave-owning farmers living along Wilson's Creek. In 1860, their property was valued at more than $11,000, quite a sum at that time. Their home was burned in 1862, probably by pro-Union guerrillas. Joseph was arrested in 1863 and was imprisoned as a rebel in Alton, Illinois. Following the war, Joseph and Mary lived in Howell County, where Mary died in 1867. Joseph returned to Christian County, where he died in 1873 and was buried in the Forbes Cemetery near Nixa. Sergeant William Watson, Company K, 3rd Louisiana, recalled the devastation of the farm of Joseph and Mary Sharp, located near where you stand. Immediately in the rear of the battery was a pretty substantial farmhouse with extensive barns and outhouses. All the buildings were completely riddled by cannon shot. I was sent with a small party to search all of the houses in case some of the enemy had taken refuge or hidden themselves there. We found several of the enemy in a hayloft who surrendered as prisoners. I forced the back door of the dwelling house, which was locked, and entered the kitchen. Several cannon shots had passed through, and the floor was strewn with dust and broken crockery. I examined the other rooms and found nobody. I was about to retire when one of the boys called to me that there was a stair down to a cellar, and we might catch someone down there. A woman jumped up and confronted me. The old woman went up to the stairs first, but on seeing the wreck and looking out and seeing the dead men and the horses lying about the front of the house, she broke out in a greater fury than ever. Who was going to pay for all of this? Who was going to take away them dead folks and dead horses? Was she to have them lying stinking around her house? I was glad to get away and join the regiment, which was now forming to proceed to another part of the field. Joseph and Mary Sharp were among the more prosperous slave-owning farmers living along Wilson's Creek. In 1860, their property was valued at more than $11,000, by some at that time. Their home was burned in 1862, probably by pro-Union guerrillas. Joseph was arrested in 1863 and was imprisoned as a rebel in Alton, Illinois. Following the war, Joseph and Mary lived in Howell County, where Mary died in 1867. Joseph returned to Christian County, where he died in 1873 and was buried in the Forbes Cemetery near Nixa.
Enter your stop number now.
In the pre-dawn hours of Saturday, August 10, 1861, General Nathaniel Lyon led the bulk of his army onto the battlefield, passing Elijah Short's farmhouse, where advanced units of his army encountered Southern soldiers foraging for breakfast. Encountered Southern soldiers foraging for breakfast. By 5:30, Lyon had advanced up the northern slope of Oak Hill, soon to be known as Bloody Hill. As his men reached the crest, they were stopped by artillery fire from the Pulaski Light Artillery of the Confederate Army. Lyon's artillery, Company F, 2nd U.S. Artillery, led by Captain James Totten, unlimbered and replied with counter-battery fire. This cannon duel effectively stopped Lyon's advance and allowed General Sterling Price to deploy his Missouri State Guard in the first of 4 charges up Bloody Hill from their camps near the Edwards cabin in the creek valley below. Over the next 6 hours, both sides were locked in a battle of amateur, inexperienced soldiers. At 9:30, General Lyon was killed while leading the 2nd Kansas Volunteer Infantry in a counterattack against the Southern forces. 2 hours later, his subordinate, Major Samuel Sturgis, seeing the Federal forces running dangerously low on ammunition, ordered the army to retreat and fall back on Springfield. Fighting on Bloody Hill had been intense, with total casualties around 2,300, of which over 500 were killed. Today's peaceful setting belies the confusion and mayhem of battle fought here on the morning of August 10th, 1861. Altogether, 31 cannon were used during the battle, 16 guns with the Federal forces, and 15 with the combined Confederate and Missouri State Guard forces. The area around you saw the heaviest fighting during the battle. Lines for both sides ran east and west across the hill and were as close as 30 to 40 yards apart as the two sides slammed into each other. Imagine the scene. Thousands of men, many dressed in blue uniforms, fought, suffered, and died here in the stifling heat, chased by clouds of gunpowder smoke, and deafened by the roar of musket and artillery fire, coupled with the screams of the wounded and dying. Lieutenant John Du Bois' Union Battery turned back Confederate forces and raised cornfield across Wilson's Creek and left the field black with their dead. After protecting Lyon's left flank on Bloody Hill, wounding and killing so many that it seemed as if everything was covered in blood. The only significant Confederate cavalry charge during the battle was stopped in its tracks by Du Bois and Totten's guns, coupled with musket fire from the 1st Iowa Infantry and U.S. Regular Infantry. Totten later called this cavalry charge utterly worthless. If you continue along the trail until you reach the edge of the woods, the trail to the left will take you to the location of the Lyon Monument.
Enter.
In the years after the war, thousands of men on both sides gathered on former fields of battle with their families, remembered and reflected on their combat experiences. Many of the Union and Confederate veterans returned to Bloody Hill. The 2 largest reunions were held in 1883 and 1897, though there were several other smaller gatherings. The monument before you, the only one in the park, was erected in 1928. General Lyon was not killed at this point, but rather somewhere nearby. But this is the spot where returning veterans of the battle erected stones with their names etched upon them to remember their fallen comrades. This permanent monument calls us to remember the sacrifices of so many on this field. The Lyon marker, like the Vietnam Memorial, is a symbol of sacrifice and of reconciliation, a spot where men once in war Good now. Find peace.
It's the end of it.
I'm sorry, that stop number is invalid. Please enter